This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And today's episode is the first in a series that I want to do to remedy a problem that has run not only throughout this podcast, but so much of the way that the story of humans has been told, which is that it is overwhelmingly told as a story of the West, of Europe and its colonial offshoots like America. So what about the rest? What themes and quirks does their history hide, and what forces, if any, prevented them of matching Europe's rise? I aim to cover these topics for several countries and cultures over the next year, but I wanted to start with China. This is for two reasons. First, China keeps getting a lot of attention, as you might have noticed, in the English-speaking media, but in my opinion, this attention is not always matched by an appropriate level of understanding of the country's history. And second, China's is the history that I know best myself. I read my master's in China studies, and I lived in Beijing for almost 2 years. Now, also to serve you well on this front, I decided to team up with Jordan Schneider, a fellow alumni of Peking University and host of the very popular podcast ChinaTalk. Our guest is Yasheng Huang, an economist from MIT, who has written one of my all-time favorite books on China's past and present. The book is titled The Rise and Fall of the East, and I couldn't recommend it highly enough. The book touches both on the long arc of China's history and on the present day. And we're going to divide this into 2 episodes, so the first one will be about the long arc. There, Huang's main argument is that China and Europe were not that different before the year, say, 500. Yes, there were differences. We'll get to some of those in this episode. But the real difference comes after. And this difference comes with the fall of the Roman Empire. And most importantly, with the fact that once Rome falls, Europe never returns to a unified rule. The Han Dynasty in China, mostly doing its thing at the same time as the Romans in Europe, also collapses. But unlike Europe, China is unified again. And when China is unified again around the year 600 under the Sui dynasty, the Chinese leaders also stumble on something of a magic formula to stay unified. And not only stay unified as a big country, but also stay unified as a culture with a common language, a common cultural code, and this is really important, with a common route to power, a formal, well-organized, non-violent, and seemingly meritocratic way to choose those who have political power. And this, of course, is the Chinese famous civil service exams, or Keju in Chinese. But this did have a downside. The civil service exams did become something of an intellectual black hole, something which focused Chinese intellectual energies for centuries. And so the Galileo Galileis or the Voltaires of China were there, but they weren't innovating and writing against the established order. They were studying hard to become part of it. Or so goes Huang's argument. I'll let him try to convince you of it. But before I do, I just want to quickly say that if you enjoy this conversation, if you enjoy my work more generally in making zero-cost material, which explores humanities and human sciences and in a way that also makes it relevant to big questions around our self-understanding as humans, then do consider showing your support. It can be anything small as subscribing to it if you haven't done so yet, and especially giving a nice review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I also want to thank all the wonderful Patreon supporters who make this work possible with their small monthly donation. Those small donations really add up to something that makes a big difference for me. And if you're someone who hasn't joined Patreon yet, but is a long-term fan of the show, then please do consider heading to patreon.com/onhumans today and make this work more sustainable. Finally, I just want to say that hearing names of dynasties, Chinese words that you might not know how to pronounce, I know that can be a little bit off-putting. We'll do our best to avoid that as much as possible in the episode, but I also have in the show notes, as always, some keywords, and also in this case, a little bit of a rough timeline to make it easier for you to follow what's happening. But without further ado, I bring to you my friend Jordan Schneider, together with me interviewing one of the great China scholars of our time, Professor Yasheng Huang.
Professor, thank you so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Yeah, good to see you, Jordan. Good to see you, Hilary.
Great to have you here.
I want to start with Emperor Wanli and Henry VIII. Give us the contrast.
Well, they lived close to each other, right? In historical terms, they were neighbors, but they lived in dramatically different political systems. The point of that story is to say that England and China differed long time ago rather than as a recent phenomenon. And the basic difference was that when they didn't have to deal with anybody to do what he wanted to do. And the specific thing that he wanted to do was to nominate his third son to be his successor. But that was being pushed back by Confucian bureaucrats. He was dealing with subordinates, whereas Henry VIII had to deal with peers, right? Peer opposition. And the biggest peer was the Pope, right? So he had to get a permission to divorce his wife, to marry Anne Boleyn. Whereas for Wang Li, he didn't need the permission at all. And he only encountered the opposition from the bureaucrats on this one issue and this one issue alone. Otherwise, he was completely free of any constraints. So that was kind of the point of the story. The difference between the East and the West was laid down long time ago. And that historical imprinting has some bearing on the differences between China and the West today.
So we've got, Henry VIII, who wants to marry this woman and has to fight tooth and nail against all of these other forces in the system, whereas Emperor Wan Li, basically no one was going to do a coup against him. No one was going to really push back. There were no other power centers, and even all these ministers who kept giving him hard trouble. At the end of the day, he held all the cards when it came to his relationship with them. So with that image, I would like to fly all the way back to pre-Sui China. Let's do the sort of the same contrast between what was going on in the Han and post-Han era and what you saw, I guess, in the Roman Empire.
So one very intriguing thing, which I got actually when I visited Greece many years ago. If you go and visit these historical sites, right, a lot of these early Western civilization placed value on violence, warfare, battle, and many of its luminary leaders came from the military background. And when you look at the Chinese early history, definitely there was violence, there was warfare, there was no question about it. But there was something I didn't quite see in the history of the West, which is this emphasis on assessing human capital through artificially created metrics, right? Essentially exam. And rather than promoting or demoting people according to your record on the battlegrounds. And that was, according to the historical record, that goes way back. It goes way before the Sui dynasty, which happened in the 6th century. And the Sui dynasty essentially institutionalized that method. Just a little bit of a history. Qing dynasty, which unified China in 221 BCE, China was unified until 220 CE, and then it collapsed, dissolved into multiple kingdoms, multiple territory units, and the warfare broke out among them. So kind of going back to the pre-Qing era. What Sui did was a reunified China from this disunity. So it's similar to what Qing did in 220 BCE. But one big difference was that Sui dynasty invented this exam system. In Chinese, it's called quirks, that kept China unified. So Qing dynasty unified China, but it didn't succeed in keeping the country unified. Whereas if you look at the era after the Sui dynasty, most of that time, China was unified. There were periods of time that China fell into disunity, notably in the 20th century. But most of the time, China was unified. And then I attributed that to the Keju system. Whereas Roman Empire essentially kept its empire together mostly through military conquest. Some political governance method as well, but they didn't succeed in unifying the empire for long, right? It collapsed. And then Europe basically never went back to Roman Empire, despite the efforts by many generals and many leaders. And Europe today basically is a reflection of the fragmented situation that happened after Roman Empire collapsed.
Bringing that moment of Sui as a kind of threshold watershed moment in China's history is really, I think, eye-opening. Like, it raises a lot of new questions and gives a lot of new answers, and I'm sure we want to ask you about that. But before we do, one more look at the time before it. There's this period of fragmentation that you already mentioned between the collapse of the Han before the reunification, which you call the Han Sui interregnum. And you kind of, I guess, tongue in cheek, call that China's European moment. So, in what sense was this period that kind of most people don't even really have a good word for? In what sense is that China's European moment?
So first of all, the Han Sui interregnum, it's an era that most historians kind of don't pay much attention to. Han Dynasty was, 400 years, and Tang Dynasty is another glorious dynasty, Song Dynasty, another glorious dynasty. This kind of period in between, who cares, right? I call it a European moment in the following sense. It's similar to the post-Roman Empire era in the sense of just fragmentation and political freedom, ideological freedom, and warfare, constant changes of the government, the importance of the nobility, the mobility of human capital, and crucially, that was the peak of Chinese technological inventiveness. It was also the peak of Chinese humanistic creativity and creation. If you look at the measure of technological development and humanistic creativity, they coincided during that era, right? And I don't think it happened by accident.
Could you talk a little bit about how those measures work? I mean, I think we were both quite impressed with Jordan. There's some really fascinating graphs. But can you give a little bit more of an idea what exactly are you measuring when you have some technological development or humanistic development, etc.?
So that work we build on really the shoulders of the giant, and the giant in this case, Joseph Needham, Professor Joseph Needham of Cambridge University. His students, his colleagues, compiled 27 volumes on Chinese science and civilization. So the documentation was done by him and his team. There's still a Needham Institute at Cambridge University even today. Needham himself died in 1995. What we did, and that was a collaborative project with Chinese academics, we spent 6 years digitizing this impressive collection of information. Needham, it turns out, even though he himself was a scientist, he never really looked at his material statistically and in a sort of using data approach to analyze the information he collected. So by the way, I'm writing a whole book on Needham question together with my Chinese collaborators. All of us were responsible for creating this database. So that was the database we created. And we had some 40-something research assistants, and it took us 6 years. So what we did was, it sounds simple, but the process of doing it was incredibly difficult and complex. essentially we tally up the number of inventions that Joseph Needham compiled, and then divide that number by population. And the Chinese historians have come up with very complete estimates of Chinese population dynasty by dynasty. And so that's another work by giant before us. There's no way we could do that ourselves. Our contribution is digitization, analyzing the information using a data approach. And amazingly, that data approach reveals insights that I don't think we are able to get just by reading historical materials and telling historical stories. One of the fundamental findings from our work is that the peak happened during this European moment. That there's absolutely no way you can get that insight by just reading Needham's 27 volumes, right? And then we also have a measure of historical development in terms of humanistic creation. One was actually published more recently by a group of scientists using using textual data to analyze the textual richness of Chinese historical documents. And it turns out this Han-Sui interregnum had the highest level of textual richness measured by how many writers referred to the text created during that era compared with the text created in other eras. So it is actually quite amazing. When I went into this, and sometimes I get pushback by people saying that, oh, you're ideological, you have your mind make up before you began to do that. I'm not a historian, and the Han-Sui interregnum, the only thing I knew about that era was the kingdom of the three kingdoms of romance that I read when I was a primary school student. I really knew nothing about that era. How can I have a prior view of to be so precise? It really just came from data. And so that's another thing I want to do in this book. I don't invoke values or even theories. I let data speak. I let facts speak. And we follow data and facts to their letter and to their spirit. I really want to push back this view, which is that automatically you have a Western ideological view because you emphasize diversity, freedom, and competition, and that somehow is ideology rather than fact. I'm telling that story from Chinese own history, right? And so I do hope that I win some hearts from people who have an automatic immunity to Western ideas.
Yeah. Sorry. I think that sort of, that is like one of the more interesting and I think challenging parts of your book is like you sort of push back on a lot of the scholarship that has been trying to look at these questions of, China's technological rise and fall and what keeps it unified or not, by bringing some interesting data sets to the field. So I'm curious, maybe the broader question is like, methods for understanding China. Like, why do you think there has been so much overweighting on these sorts of like narratives that you can kind of assert, particularly when it regards to this question? Like, why did it take until 2023 for someone to write your book?
Well, so there I do believe, I'm a professor at MIT, so I do have some belief in the ability of systematic approach, systematic method to review and provide us with insights, right? My ultimate interest is to review if there are general principles, if there are regularities in history, in society, in economy, in politics. So younger scholars are doing more and more of that. But let me just also add that the constraint in academia now is that we get very systematic, but the stories and the arguments and the insights that we emphasize in these very systematic journals are getting smaller and smaller, right? So it's actually easy to be systematic and small. It is not that easy to be systematic and big, right? At least I try to be systematic and big, and maybe some people will say I'm not systematic enough, and other people may say I'm not big enough. But at least that's my intention to do both of these things.
I think it will be difficult to find people who say that you're not big enough. It's a wonderful big arc of history that you're offering. But let's continue the arc. I mean, so at the moment, so we see that during the Han Sui interregnum, we have this China's European moment, but as you mentioned earlier, there are already seeds of using exams or a history of using exams and things like that on a level that is not, we don't really see in the West. Long story short, we get the Sui dynasty, we get a big, very systematic examination system where a lot of political power, although the emperor has the ultimate say, a lot of the middle management is more and more taken in via this standardized examination system. And that ends up being kind of a blessing and a curse for China. Is that a fair, quick summary of what's happening next in your story?
That's a very fair. And interestingly speaking, a lot of the liberal intellectuals in China criticize Keju. They think it's really bad. It is memorization, nothing else, conservative and even reactionary. I agree with that. But on the other hand, I also see that the Keju system contributed tremendously to the Chinese human capital development, to the literacy. And even, so let me just make sure that your audience knows this. Keju was only open to the male segment of the population. It was never open to the female segment of the population. But there was a spillover effect, right? Because mothers were mainly responsible for bringing up their boys and educating them. And the preparation for Keju started very early, 3 years old, 4 years old. So mothers had to be able to read and write. And it's not an accident that in terms of 20th century economic miracles, many of them happened in East Asia with the legacy of Keju, the human capital. So one of the things that Keju did was a homogenized human capital. Right? We can come back to the bad side of that, but let me just emphasize the positive side. When you work in a factory, when you work in manufacturing, when you try to scale your EVs, when you try to scale your solar panels, if you have inconsistent human capital from one worker to another worker, you cannot scale these technologies. Going back to the shirts that we wear, going back to the shoes that we wear, it's not just high tech. Even this low tech, anything that you have to do at scale requires consistency, requires human capital consistency. And Keju, I'm not saying it's the only thing, but Keju contributed critically to the formation of that human capital consistency. Not the bad part.
Actually, before we go to the bad part, could I ask one more thing about the good parts?
Okay.
So one of the things that I was really surprised when reading your book is how much you suggest that there was genuine social mobility created by the Keju, because the really short story, often people say, look, in Europe, you have to be an aristocrat to have political power. In China, anyone can take this exam. And I was always like, yeah, okay. But no farmer is actually going to be able to train their son for this exam and actually succeed. So it's a nice story to tell, but actually the outcome is the same thing. The aristocratic kids get a good education, the farmers don't have a chance. And you suggested I've been a bit too bleak, right?
Yeah. The historians who study Keju use the term social mobility. I may have used that term as well in my book, but more precisely, it is political mobility.
But there was genuine political mobility.
Oh, absolutely.
And how would you convince a skeptic about that?
Oh, okay, very easily. So again, going back to our earlier conversation about data, this is not something you can just use stories to illustrate. You kind of have to use statistics and data. They are historians who study Keju, and then they say, so they are historians on both sides. The earlier historian, Ping Di Ho, who really pioneered the Keju research, showed that Keju was meritocratic, had the mobility. But later historians say, oh, no, actually, so-and-so, came from prominent family, and he also succeeded, he got promoted. But the problem with that is, how do you know it is the prominent family part that contributed to his mobility? Maybe he was extremely smart, right? So I'm not saying that the second view is necessarily wrong, but all I'm saying is that just telling that story itself is not convincing enough to make your point. What we did was, so this is a work I did with Claire Young at University of Washington. We ran statistical tests on the effect of family backgrounds on your exam performance, right? Whether or not you came from a rich family, whether or not you came from a politically prominent family, your father was government official, your grandfather was government official. And then statistically, if that background influenced your exam score, we should be able to see it. We should be able to detect that effect in the statistical results we generated. So Keju had 3 rounds. In the first 2 rounds that were anonymized, we didn't see any effect of family backgrounds on your exam scores, right? So that's quite impressive. Going back to 6th century, 7th century, 9th century, 13th century, that your backgrounds didn't influence your exam scores. And that means that they had a pretty good system. It's called anonymization. China actually invented the double-blind system. The examiner didn't know who examinee was. Examinee didn't know who examiner was. And that was really incredible. That was an incredible invention. And Chinese should get the credit for it. So that really is to me, that's a more convincing evidence that the Keju system was truly meritocratic.
I think this is a nice transition to talk about, come back to sort of the court politics dynamics, because there is this one fascinating point that you brought up in looking at the sort of like educational attainment and family background was actually at the very richest people, there was a bit of a negative correlation because the emperor is smart and they know that they don't want to have a chief minister who actually has like money and connections and land or whatever, which sort of comes to this sense that you made very clear of there just not being other power centers. Let's talk a little bit about the sort of court dynamics and how the emperor's ability to literally handpick whoever gets to join the top echelon of your Junshi class shaped China for so many centuries.
Yeah, so that's earlier I said in the first 2 rounds, the family backgrounds didn't affect the exam scores. In the final round, it's called the palace exam. It was partially written exam, partially a oral exam. The oral exam was presided by the emperor. So he was the examiner in chief. That had to be non-anonymized, right? Because the examiner-in-chief was doing this oral examination. He had to know who the examinee was. So during that round, the backgrounds were known to the examiner. And the surprising finding is that the rich families did worse during that round rather than doing better. That's very counterintuitive. Think about even the North American universities today. Rich kids, tend to do well, right? And their parents donate money and do all these things. Usually, there's a positive correlation between socioeconomic backgrounds of the kid and his or her educational access in contemporary society. But here we had a negative correlation. And the way that we explain this, and that's very consistent with other pieces of evidence of the Chinese imperial system, the way that Claire and I explain this is the emperor didn't want people from independent power base to be in the central government. The final round selected the most important officials into the central court of the imperial dynasty. And the final round selected people who design future Keju examinations and who advised the government, who had face-to-face time with the emperor, right? So essentially, you use this system to marginalize the nobility and the people who succeeded in commerce. You don't mind using them at a lower level, right? At a regional level, far away from the capital. They're smart, then we use them. But close to you, you don't want them nearby. Earlier, we talked about the contrast between China and Europe. That's an incredibly big contrast between China and Europe. Look at the European royal families. They're all connected with each other. Anne Boleyn, the Henry VIII, the wife that he tried to divorce from Catherine, right? So they all came from prominent European families, and they had this power base on their own. They had economic base on their own, and they can, the emperor, the king was definitely the most powerful, but he had to share power with these peers. In China, you had this vertical system where the emperor absolutely dominated everybody else. There was another provision in the imperial court, which is that the concubines that went into the imperial court couldn't be from other royal families, couldn't be from nobility backgrounds. They had to be people from peasant backgrounds, from remote areas. They also had very, very detailed rules to exclude the prominent people from being part of the government. So it's a very well thought of system. I don't really know how and who came up with this idea. Maybe it's just a collective wisdom of that gradually evolved to be that way. But in terms of maintaining power, it is as clever as you could get.
Another really interesting layer of this was how you dealt with the top ministers, because look, okay, you can filter them out for having, having independent money, but look, these are very talented, ambitious people, and you're gonna have differences with your ministers, but you have this fun other data set where you look at, or why don't you talk about how emperors dealt with ministers they weren't super fond of, and what what benefit that gave back to the system.
So we know the statistical patterns, the interpretations that I supplied were based on that pattern. The pattern is the following. Earlier in the Chinese history, a lot of the ministers got executed. Later in the imperial history, dynastic history after Kuzhu, right? Kuzhu happened roughly in the middle of the Chinese imperial history. Later after that, the ministers resigned and voluntarily left their positions as a way to resolve their differences with the emperor. The way that I explain this is that earlier period, you had these bureaucrats and ministers who disagree with the emperor on more fundamental issues, right? And if you don't eliminate them, they may come back and launch a coup against you. So essentially, you want to eliminate these people physically to prevent the future threat posed by these people. Whereas the later bureaucrats, after Kuzhu, they basically buy into the apple pie, right? American dream and baseball and all of that. So, they may not like you, they may disagree with you on specific policy, but never occurred to them in their mind to overthrow you, to launch a coup against you. Claire Yang and I are writing a whole book about the political evolution of Chinese history, and we have actually even more precise data to show that the coup d'etat, the frequency of coup d'etat declined dramatically after Kuzhu as compared with the period before Kuzhu, right? So it goes, all these kind of evidence points to the same direction. Essentially, after the Kuzhu basically was an ideological tool to homogenize human capital, both in terms of skills, which we talked about before, but also in terms of ideology, right?
I think that's a really nice link from the discussion that we started with on the frictionless autocracy, as you describe, of the Chinese emperors, to the exam system. Basically, the idea that the exam system, because it sucks all the human capital and sucks people in and gives this channel for political mobility, you don't end up having other power centers. But then the other question is about technology. And so you already hinted that when you really look at when are Chinese inventions bubbling up, they tend to bubble up before the Sui dynasty. And then you have a decrease. And you have a really impressive graph which shows, and it's actually really funny, for example, it's not only the Kyrgyz system, it's also just other ideologies. So there's a really strong correlation, you say, between, for example, the prevalence of Buddhism and innovativeness, not necessarily because Buddhists are innovative, but because the presence of Buddhism shows that there is intellectual diversity and all of these things start to decline after the Sui. But I think the most obvious counter example that, any China historian would give is the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty is often regarded as one of the most innovative periods. You get the gunpowder. A lot of the great Chinese inventions, if they weren't made during the Song, they are refined during the Song. You have Yasheng Huang, this kind of legendary Da Vinci style figure who's a polymath in everything. To many people's eyes, it's the Song that is the China's European moment, if we want to use that terminology, looking at the Renaissance Europe now. You don't seem to agree, or to the extent that you agree, is that a problem for the overarching argument?
Yeah, so I think that's a very strong pushback against the idea and the thesis of my book. But we have a way to deal with it. And as I said before, I'm working with Chinese academics on a whole book on history of Chinese technology. Is forthcoming from Princeton University Press, and we are halfway through the book. So I will go into that. We go into that issue in more detail than I did in the book. The Song dynasty, from our perspective, is seemingly an anomaly, but let me explain it. So this is beyond the book now. It's more about my next book. First of all, I don't think Song is a European moment, right? So it's a unified empire and trending toward one ideology. So just in terms of descriptively, it is very, very different from the European situation. The only similarity is the inventiveness, right? Song Dynasty was very inventive. It invented 3 out of the 4 big inventions coming out of China: gunpowder, printing, and compass. The only thing that Song Dynasty didn't invent was paper, which was invented in the Han Dynasty. So this is a legitimate pushback, which is that even though we show that there are more inventions per capita before Song, you could make an argument that Song was more important in terms of coming up with more important inventions. Okay, so in the book we're working on now, we have developed a measure that measures how important an invention is. So those 3 inventions are incredibly important, but there are also other inventions that are also important. So we shouldn't just look at those 3. So what we did was, okay, let's just say for the sake of the argument that an important invention is 50 times as important as an unimportant invention, or 100 times. It doesn't really matter what the factor is. We just gave you an arbitrary factor. Let's give those, it's called a weighted measures. Let's give those inventions more weights. It can be 100, it can be 50, it can be 500, it can be 50,000. Let's just see if this pattern changes as a result of weighting, gunpowder and these inventions more than other inventions. The pattern is exactly the same. Therefore, even if you take into account how important an invention is, it is still the pattern that the Han-Sui interregnum was the most inventive of all the periods. In fact, if we weight the important inventions more, Han-Sui interregnum came out to be even more impressive. A lot of people didn't know this. People talk about the 4 big inventions, but during the Han-Sui interregnum, Chinese mathematicians made a lot of advances in the sort of more pure math rather than applied math. There were many, many other inventions created during that period that were also very, very important, right? So the 4 big inventions is a little bit misleading because these are the 4 that people know more about, but they didn't know that there were these other inventions that were also as important. When you gave them more weight, then the Han-Sui interregnum also shows up as quite much more impressive than the Song Dynasty.
I guess one question that we haven't touched upon at all is that, yes, there are no other political, ideological power bases, but one thing that you mentioned several times, and which might be relevant to the song, but is a little bit of a wild card here, is what about commerce? So if you look at Britain, for example, leading up to the Industrial Revolution, I mean, I had for example, your colleague at MIT, Darren Asimoglu, with James Robinson, would put a lot of emphasis on the way that commercial power as a competitor to political power is why England becomes what it was and was able to industrialize. How do you see commerce playing into this whole story of frictionless autocracy in China? Is it an anomaly? And what about the song? Is the fact that you have so much commerce going on the reason that song still has this innovativeness that maybe is lost then during the later dynasties? I don't know. It's a bit of an open question, but I'm really happy to hear any of your thoughts about the role of commerce as a power base in Chinese history.
So let's unpack commerce into 2 effects, right? One is the effect on technology. The other is the effect on politics. On technology, I do believe that there is a connection between vibrant commerce and technology, and soon possibly achieved. By the way, our overall measure of soon is good, but not as impressive as historians assumed. But it was pretty good. Commerce probably had to do with it, right? But the way we think about, I think about this issue is that commerce is one of many factors, and so commerce probably played a role in the Western Industrial Revolution, but commerce played that role in the overall context of political freedom, intellectual freedom, rather than playing that role all by itself. I don't think commerce all by itself could launch industrial revolution. It had to be part of that, right? And China historians really have written a lot about commerce throughout Chinese history. So it's not that China didn't have commerce. China had commerce. China had merchants, and even quite big merchants. But the fundamental difference between Chinese commerce and Chinese merchant development and the European commerce is that Chinese commerce always operated in a very restricted environment. Think about China today. Think about Jack Ma today, right? And, he prospered. He developed a huge commercial empire, but in a very constrained political environment, at the pleasure of the Chinese leader. So the Song Dynasty probably had that flavor, and so I would argue, in that restricted environment, it could foster technology, but only up to a point. It couldn't really go all the way in terms of launching industrial revolution. Industrial revolution was an incredibly complex social, political, intellectual engineering. I just don't think commerce was the only thing. When Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson wrote about that, implicitly they were writing about that in a broader political context, right? So we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of politics, I think more and more the evidence shows, and China today is a good piece of evidence, commerce itself doesn't change politics. It just doesn't. It has to be commerce together with other things. And the Song Dynasty had vibrant commerce, and obviously it didn't change the nature of autocracy in the Song Dynasty, and arguably after the Song Dynasty, China became even more autocratic. If you look at the ideological diversity, Song Dynasty invented one of the most restrictive ideologies of Chinese philosophy, the New Confucianism, and Buddhism essentially collapsed during the Song Dynasty, and then Taoism began to go down, right? So commerce itself does not change politics.
So I think, it's an interesting way to, you mentioned kind of the long arc. One of the more dramatic things you said at the very beginning, one of the downsides of not valorizing generals and generalship is that, you kind of lose more wars. The Han people did a lot of that over the past 2,000 years. But really remarkably, I don't think Kublai Khan was particularly interested in Confucius when he grew up. Same with the Qing, right? But the sort of the invaders from the north ending up taking a lot of the sort of patterns that were established because they found them so useful. Can you talk a little bit about how this tradition was able to, metamorphosize and, keep trending in this direction even after so much, interaction with, with border countries and ultimately, being taken over a few times by foreign people who you wouldn't bet on, nomadic horse tribes to all of a sudden think that 8-legged essays were really the way to go to run their country.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting piece of history, right? Which is the reverse takeover by China and by the Kojü system. The Mongols, none of that Kojü stuff was there in their culture, in their civilization. It was really kind of a war fighting civilization. And then they didn't continue Kojü for a period of time. And so again, I'm not a historian, so I don't know the specific historical turning point. But then at some point, they said to themselves, gee, I mean, that thing is actually very useful to us. And I think the reason, so this is just hypothesis, I think the reason is that they were ruling such a big empire, right? So the Yuan dynasty is a big empire. To rule such a big empire, you need a lot of bureaucrats. You need a lot of human capital. You need capable people to preside over this big territory. And Kojü is the way to give you that human capital, right? And Kojü, in the particular way that Kojü was organized and run, gave you the kind of consistency that you would want when you preside over such a big empire. And Yuan dynasty not only resurrected Kojü, they actually innovated on the margin by giving the Kojü curriculum the most restrictive ideology. And the Mongols were extremely smart. They used the Han Chinese invention, Kojü. They also used the Han Chinese invention of the ideology, the new Confucianist ideology invented by Zhuxi in the Song dynasty. They used these two things to make Kojü the most restrictive institution ever in Chinese history, right? So the narrowing, you began to see the narrowing, during the Song dynasty, but the true narrowing of the curriculum happened under Yuan dynasty. And then under Ming, the Ming dynasty ruled by the Chinese, they basically used the Mongols' modifications of the Kojü and then apply that to their rule. So Yuan dynasty made a huge contribution to the Chinese political system. And it also shows the power of Kojü, right? The Qing dynasty was not run by the Chinese, but at the beginning they also didn't. They had some second thoughts, but they immediately began to find Kojü to be useful. So the communist period too, right? So it is a toolkit for the autocrats.
Totally. And I think that's kind of the key takeaway from this whole system is basically you're trading scale for, dynamism and ingenuity. Yeah. And you see it across the entire system. It's like, look, it's great to have 10,000 bureaucrats. If you're getting the ones that are really good at memorizing, books and books of Confucius, they're probably going to be pretty smart. But they won't necessarily be, radical and innovative and coming up with dramatic innovations, both on the upside as well as potentially on the downside when they, get their own ideas for greatness. And it's kind of the same thing with primogeniture for the emperors, right? As like, all right, if everyone knows the first son is going to be the one that's going to be emperor, you're maybe not getting the best son. But you're also not getting the mess that comes with having to select the best son, where, you're looking at what the Ottoman Empire had to do, where, all the sons have to like fight and battle themselves, or the Yuan dynasty, where, you have all this kind of like, I guess like, most of the time, you end up having a sort of like the cream rises to the top in political systems, but like it takes a lot of bloodshed to get there. I don't know, thoughts, reflections on that?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent observation. And the way that I think about history, political history, of both East and West is that, each political system figured out a way to resolve conflicts. Right? Democracy is a way to resolve conflicts. I'm peer with you, I disagree with you, we can fight it out, right? Or we can agree to disagree and agree to the rules of the game, maybe elections. So next time I can become president, I can become prime minister. Autocracy is also a way to resolve conflicts. You disagree with me, I kill you, right? And you disagree with me, I educate you, right? Ideological indoctrination and brainwashing. Primogeniture is a way to resolve conflicts, right? So imagine if you have unclear rules of succession. Hopefully we'll get to that later, right? About what's going on in China now. If you don't have clear rules of the succession, that is a prescription for conflicts and troubles, right? Primogeniture, you may not get the best son, but at least the rules of the game are super clear. People don't fight over who the successor was. And this is where Wan Li was potentially dangerous to the regime, to the system, because he was proposing to violate that rule. And that's why the Confucian mandarins, who normally wouldn't oppose anything that emperor proposed, vigorously push back, right? Because they see that as really undermining a critical rule of the game, the rule of the succession. But then the Chinese system improvised on that. And so one of the things that they did was Confucian mandarins would invest time and efforts into educating the young successor very early on. So part of the clash between Wan Li and his Confucian mandarins was over the timing of succession arrangement. You got to anoint your successor early on, so we could come in and educate the son into the Confucian methodology, Confucian values, and Confucian ethics, right? So that's an extra insurance policy you write to make sure even if the son is not that smart, we got to educate him early on. So the way I think about this is it's all about resolving conflicts. Sometimes you resolve that conflicts by giving up some of your control. Sometimes you resolve the conflicts by claiming control. And China adopted the second method.
Let's take it to the late Qing, where things start falling apart. You start to have, more commerce, exposure to the West, an increasing understanding that something isn't working, losing wars. You have new ideologies come in. I mean, a fun one is the Taiping Rebellion, right? Where basically if you were a failed civil, if you failed at taking your exams, you would kind of disappear into history and go farm or whatever. But now when you get new ideologies, all of a sudden you can think you're Jesus's son and start a whole revolution. And by 1905, the center doesn't hold. Kuju dies, and then we're out into the Republican era. Talk a little bit about that transition, and before we get to Mao, what were and weren't continuities between this imperial tradition and what we saw in that period?
So a number of things. One was that the population during the Qing Dynasty grew dramatically. So the Kuju system was very competitive. When the denominator grew and you don't change the numerator, the ratio goes down. So it became more and more difficult and competitive to succeed at Keju. So that's number one. Number two was that the Qing dynasty never, they adopted Keju, but then they also saw that Keju advantaged the Han Chinese, right? The Han Chinese got this right. They had thousands of years of training. So it's very much like Chinese taking SAT. All of them ace the SAT because they have been doing this. And so the Han Chinese always beat out the Manchurians, and so that didn't make the Manchurians very happy. So they actually lowered the number. I cited some statistics, but I may not be precise now. But it's something like, it was a dramatic decline in terms of the ratio. So not only you didn't increase the enrollments, you actually decrease the enrollments when the denominator is growing. The third thing is ideology. And so Keju succeeded in stamping out Buddhism, Taoism, and all these other things. But hey, Christianity is a different animal. And then it arrived in China so in such a force, right? And also it's probably a more challenging ideology to deal with as compared with Taoism and Buddhism, right? In terms of God, in terms of, I'm not a religious scholar, so I'm just saying nonsense here, but it was probably just more difficult to deal with as a ideology. So then you have Western intrusion, right? And so all these things compounded each other, and then they contributed to the weakness of the rule by the Manchurians. And the Taiping Rebellion is a very telling of that story, right? So it had a Western ideology. It had a failed candidate of the Keju 4 times, right? And then he gravitated toward Christianity. It occurred to him, well, maybe I don't have to be a farmer. Maybe I can rebel and so essentially Hong Xiuquan didn't buy in the overall legitimacy of this system, something that Keju has succeeded for generations and generations before. In his case, it failed, right? Why, so the historians probably have better answers, but it failed on him. So he launched this crippling rebellion, and the rebellion did something else. The rebellion, in the end, it was suppressed. But on the other hand, it drained the resources from the government, right? So the government needed money. So they began to sell government positions, right? And further undermining the legitimacy and the credibility of the Keju system, right? So all these factors, maybe not by themselves, but all together contributed to the permanent collapse of the imperial system. Then we have a republic.
And would it be right to say that there's another thing that happens, which is that to fight the Taiping Rebellion, you need to have an army, a modern army fighting the Taiping, which then creates these really powerful military leaders, which everybody familiar with that era of history will know, and then and because you have these armies, well, you start having for the first time big power centers contrasted to the Beijing central government, which ends up being in the character of Yuan Shikai, for example, ends up being very much part and parcel of how the empire crumbles down. What do you think? How big of a part of the story do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it was a big part of the story. On the other hand, I think we shouldn't overstate the importance of the military. I mean, in the end, the Republican Revolution was not launched by the generals. It was really launched by the civilians. And Yuan Shikai and those people definitely played a role, but it was not a military coup, right? So it was not a coup d'état. It was revolution by ideas, a regional rebellion. It was not at least a classic army general leading the army to topple the regime. For sure, the military got more powerful because of that. But was it? But the military was by and large trying to defend the regime rather than toppling the regime. So the toppling came about as a result of losing the ideological narrative, losing the legitimacy of this entire imperial system. I think more and more when I sort of think about these things, do research about these things, the role of idea, the role of ideology, I more and more I think that's a more important driver of history than other things, than economics or pure military power.
Well, let's talk about a leader who had like a very curious ideology. Chiang Kai-shek, he has this weird blending of like Christianity and fascism and Confucianism. What do you think he did and didn't take from from this imperial tradition? And, is there anything maybe he should have over-indexed on relative to the mix he balanced with?
So I think the nationalist party, the nationalist government, Chiang Kai-shek and his son, they have always been more conflicted as compared with the imperial leaders as well as communist leaders. So essentially, they kind of juggled between scale and scope. They never quite resolved that conflict, right? So there was some Western influence on these guys. There was definitely, the Chinese traditional autocratic tradition impinging on them. They never resolve one or the other decisively. They kind of let, maybe not 100 flowers bloom, but maybe 50 flowers bloom or 30 flowers bloom, right? And that is never a stable arrangement. When you don't have some sort of decision on scale and scope, you tend to move around and you tend to come up with ad hoc solutions. And I think the eventual democratization of Taiwan came from the lack of that earlier resolution between those tensions between scale and scope. I think Chiang Kai-shek tried to have it both ways, right? And under a autocratic veneer, which is not very good at incorporating scope, diversity, heterogeneity productively. I would say a democracy is a better way to incorporate the productivity of scope than a autocracy. And to some extent, under Deng Xiaoping, you kind of see the similar tensions, right? So it's not a great system to incorporate the advantages of scale and the scope, but they tolerated some scope conditions. Whereas the difference is that in Taiwan, they evolved to be a democracy more toward the institutionalization of scope, whereas China, as we know now, evolved in the opposite direction.
Okay, and just to make it clear, listeners, so when you say scale and scope, with scope you mean all the heterogeneity, diversity that the system can tolerate, and with scale it's how much can you do one thing a lot. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a scale economy, you produce millions of widgets, they're exactly the same. Scale political system, you have one party, one ideology. Scope is like a democracy, you have Democratic Party, Republican Party, you have liberals, you have conservatives. So my book is about how China initially struggled between these two opposing forces. and why and how they settled on one scale at the expense of scope, right? Diversity. So whereas the West arguably, well, I shouldn't say arguably, definitely kind of resolved that tension by embracing scope and by creating a system that resolves some of these conflicts in a way that advantages economic development and political, preserve the political and ideological diversity, and whereas China went in the other direction.
And I guess it's there, the Kudzu system is really one of the major scale in favor of scope situations. And
absolutely,
I think you have a really great line in your book, which is, quote, "Too much autocratic stability is detrimental. And this conclusion is not based on Western values and ideology, but on China's own history," unquote.
So, I mean, I try to tell that story by Chinese history, and whether or not people pay attention to that. I just hope to persuade people who don't have a knee-jerk aversion to the idea of diversity, competition, and who take evidence and facts seriously. And China prospered when it had a degree of diversity, both historically and in the contemporary period, right? If you care about economic growth, if you care about economic development, if you care about technology, if you care about science, I think China should be more celebratory of diversity rather than suppressing.
Okay, I think that can serve as a teaser on what is to follow. In part 2, we'll hear a lot of hot takes on how to explain the miracle of China's recent rise and what to think of its present and future. To make sure that you don't miss that, make sure to subscribe to On Humans on whatever player you're using. And also, if you want to get my breakdown of these two conversations, that will also be out in a week or two at onhumans.substack.com, where you should definitely go and order the On Humans newsletter to get that and other material that I write. So again, that's onhumans.substack.com. In a way that I hope that you enjoyed this conversation, and if you do, one more time, do hit the subscribe button. Do give On Humans a nice review. And if you're a long-term listener, I look forward to hearing from you at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope to see you again next time. Until then, take care.